Hello, everyone. This is Joey Lindstrom over at the National Low Income Housing Coalition. Thanks so much for joining us today to talk about voter registration. We're going to get started right away. I know some people are still logging on, and so I will start by sharing just some general logistics about today's presentation. So first, please know that we will allow time at the end of today's presentation for questions. But know also that there is a questions box in your webinar control panel that should appear on the right-hand side of your screen, the control panel. And at the bottom, there's a place for you to enter questions as we go along. Please know also that we will be providing a video recording and a copy of today's slides to all participants. Those will be sent tomorrow in a follow-up email from the webinar, so you will have access to that. Also, if you're experiencing any technical difficulties, please send an email to Brooke Shipwright at that email address before you on the screen. Brooke is running the technology for our webinar today, and we'll be happy to help you out with any of the complications that you might be experiencing. So let's get started by reviewing the agenda. First, I should say, many of you might be wondering, hey, Joey, where's the guest presenter today? I'm sorry to let you know I am in fact flying solo because of some holiday scheduling issues, but when we resume our third Thursdays at 3 series next month in January, there will be additional expert speakers. Here, though, you'll have to hear from myself about voter registration and some of the best practices and some of the types of activities that we really encourage. So we'll start by doing a brief overview of Our Homes, Our Votes. And I do this at every webinar. It takes just our first 6 slides to establish for people sort of where we come from with this campaign and why we're working on it so intently as we move towards 2020. I'll also do a quick update on the presidential campaigns, and then we'll get into our topic of the day, which is voter registration. So first, Our Homes, Our Votes. This is our effort to engage both candidates and voters about low-income housing issues and homelessness, and to specifically get low-income renters and their allies registered and mobilized at higher numbers. And when I talk about mobilization, I'm talking about getting out the vote and increasing voter turnout numbers, but also doing that through having educated, informed voters going to the polls. We also encourage and provide a lot of tools for candidate education so that the candidates running for elected office are informed on the key issues related to housing affordability and can speak intelligently to those issues as the campaigns unfold. So we do this for a couple of reasons, and this chart shows one of the primary focuses we have with the Our Homes, Our Votes effort. And you'll see that in every election, there's a significant disparity between voter participation amongst renters versus homeowners. It should not surprise us then that home ownership benefits and home ownership policies are a higher priority for the elected officials in positions of influence throughout government. This disparity can be even more extreme when we look at it not just renter versus homeowner, but by income, lower income versus higher income. And so when we wonder why lower income people are so often left out in policy, why we have people who sit on waiting lists for years and years and years to access vouchers or public housing, but people who are eligible for the mortgage interest deduction to get a tax benefit for their expensive mortgage, well, they never sit on a waiting list. It's because of the graph that you see before you right now. It's because low-income people are not voting at the same rates of higher-income people. And if we want our issues to be taken seriously by policymakers, we need to address this gap, and we need to show them that when they provide leadership on housing affordability and ending homelessness, they are rewarded with a big pile of votes. So to establish that point, NLIHC, through our Opportunity Starts at Home campaign, which we work on with several significant national partners, we produced a poll, I think, almost a year and a half ago now, where we learned some really key public attitudes about housing and the expectations of voters that candidates and elected officials should address housing. As you'll see before you, 83% of the public agrees that elected officials are currently not paying enough attention to the cost of housing. And 76% say they are more likely to vote for a candidate that has a detailed plan for making housing more affordable. And hey, speaking of candidates, some of you might have noticed that there's a presidential election underway already, and especially the Democratic primary has been attracting a lot of attention. This year, more so than previously, the National Low-Income Housing Coalition has been engaging presidential candidates, encouraging them to participate in coffees, in town hall forums, in site visits of affordable housing, to be more engaged with Our Homes, Our Votes partners throughout the country. Candidates are in Los Angeles today because they'll be debating. And what we've had over the last couple of days is a couple of really significant events involving presidential candidates. As you'll see on the screen, there's a good picture of Secretary Julian Castro, who yesterday visited Skid Row along with the Inner City Law Center, the Downtown Women's Center, Homeless Healthcare of Los Angeles, as well as our own Diane Yantel, and took a look at some of the really tremendously harrowing tent cities and very public homelessness that's growing on the streets of Los Angeles. Today, Senator Amy Klobuchar will be joining our own Diane Yantel and St. Paul Mayor Melvin Carter at a affordable housing development in Santa Monica, which is one of the most expensive housing markets in the entire country. And this is where Senator Klobuchar is going to roll out a new plan on housing first interventions to solve homelessness. So I mentioned just a moment ago that there are presidential debates going on in Los Angeles today. And we have, at the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, engaged our field throughout the country for the past several months to encourage them to join us in calling on debate moderators to ask candidates to go on record on how they would solve the housing shortage and how they would solve homelessness. We continue to do so, and just this week, on both Monday and Tuesday, we ran a full-page ad in the Los Angeles Times that listed each of the 1,024 organizations who signed on with a message to the debate moderators that we encourage them to ask a question about housing. The image that you see on the screen is a shareable image we've used for social media. The actual image on the Los Angeles Times, which you can find on ourhomes-ourvotes.org, you'll see contains a lot more explanation of our ask to the debate moderators. But if you're looking at this and you're excited that your organization was splashed all over the LA Times, or if you're feeling left out, that you haven't raised your voice with regards to the debate moderators and their role in asking a question about housing affordability and homelessness, it's not too late. I'd say tweet at them at the Twitter handles that are listed on the slide before you, and please use the Our Homes, Our Votes 2020 hashtag that you see at the bottom of the screen. Do that today. Continue to add to some of the public pressure and some of the public outcry to hear candidates talk about their solutions to the housing affordability issue. If you search for that hashtag, Our Homes, Our Votes 2020 on Twitter, you'll find that there are a lot of really good social media posts already that you can perhaps retweet with your own messaging and your own viewpoints. Again, making sure to tweet at the debate moderators who are, for this debate, from PBS and Politico. So this is an ongoing focus for us, addressing the debates and the debate moderators. We have had very recently and very happily had some success in this venture. In November, there was a debate in Atlanta, and for the first time in anyone's memory, candidates were asked about how they would solve the problem of housing affordability. Unfortunately, because of time and cutting to commercial, only Tom Steyer, Senator Elizabeth Warren, and Senator Cory Booker had an opportunity to answer the question. You might have seen several other candidates were raising their hands and trying to get in on this question and sharing their viewpoints on housing affordability. But one of the really happy realities was that all of the candidates who had a chance to answer the question answered it very well. As recently as 15 or even 10 years ago, if a question about housing affordability had been asked at a debate, all of the candidates would have just talked about affordable home ownership and so forth. In this case, they really got into some of the nitty-gritty issues that matter to the extremely low-income people that so many of us serve each day. They got into things like the importance of a right to an attorney during eviction. They talked about gentrification and confronting NIMBYism. They talked about a renter's tax credit. They talked about addressing some of the historical inequities brought about by redlining. But the debates aren't the only ways that we're engaging with the candidates. This is an updated slide. Some of you have seen it before. On the left-hand side, you'll see the fact sheet that we sent along to all presidential candidates, informing them about the solutions to the affordable housing crisis and homelessness that we hope they'll talk about in the campaign. I'll say as a side note, this is a really good practice that I hope many of you will think about doing for your own state-level elections or for your own local elections, encouraging candidates to speak intelligently about the issue by providing them early in their campaigns with your own information and perspective. But remember, of course, that when engaging candidates in any kind of nonprofit manner, you must engage all candidates so that you can't be considered to be endorsing one candidate or any one party. On this screen, you'll see on the right-hand panel that 15 candidates, some of whom are now former candidates, have released their official housing plans. This is unheard of. We've never seen this before, where 15 presidential candidates have specific plans for how they will address housing affordability. 3 of them are new, 2 new candidates in Mayor Bloomberg and Tom Steyer. And then also Governor Steve Bullock released his plan on November 4th for how he would address housing affordability as well. There are also additional Republican candidates for president who we have engaged. We've even done an event in New Hampshire with candidate William Weld, but none of them at this point have released their plans for addressing housing affordability. You'll notice missing from the candidate list on the right-hand side from the Democratic field are Vice President Biden, as well as Andrew Yang and Representative Tulsi Gabbard. All right. So that's the update on presidential engagement. If you have any questions about presidential engagement, feel free to enter them into the questions box, and when we get to the Q&A, we'll be happy to answer any of those questions. Let's roll into voter registration. So I want to start with just some of the basics. Some of these are things that you're probably already thinking about. But first, obviously, with any large-scale effort you might be undertaking, you want to start with just some quick preparation. Defining your goals in terms of who you want to register, connecting with a local board of elections or county clerk that runs the elections in your community, training your staff, your board, and your volunteers on how to do voter registration, and then considering the relevant resources. So first, let's talk about goal setting and voter registration. So one of the first things you'll want to do is define your constituency. Who is it that you want to register? Are you trying to register residents who live in the emergency shelter you provide? Are you trying to register people who utilize the community center that you work in and operate? Or do you have a list of subsidized properties in your community where you want to go knock on every door? Think about who are the voices in your community who are most commonly left out and would most significantly benefit from a larger electoral participation. Apologize for the coughing. I, like so many Americans in December, have a cold. You'll also want to produce an intended registration number. This gives you sort of a goal to strive for, and it helps you track increases over previous years. I always encourage people to produce a goal and to have a number in mind, but I always also encourage campaigns to make that a flexible goal. Sometimes when we get too focused on the number of registrations we collect, we stop focusing on the populations that we're targeting. So often, the low-income people who we want to see registering at high rates are the people who are hard to find because they work unpredictable schedules or they live in locked apartment buildings. And so if we set our goal at a certain number of registrations, we might start chasing for the easy ones if we remain too focused on the number. You'll also want to establish roles within your organization. Who's going to be tracking voter registrations, who will be collecting them and delivering them to the county clerk, who will be establishing voter registration events and creating materials to bring to community events to do tabling. But related to establishing roles, consider volunteer recruitment. Voter registration is something where you'll often find many people in your community, including college students very often, are excited to get involved and excited to involve people in the important civic engagement process. It's a great opportunity to get your board members more involved on a process that, once people are trained, is really rather simple. Know the law of registration. right? Obviously, you always want to make sure that any election engagement that you do happens within the law. If you're a 501c3 organization, remember all of your voter registration activities have to be done in a nonpartisan manner. This means that your volunteers, that your staff, when doing voter registration, can't even wear a button for a preferred candidate. It also means that when registering voters, if a voter is interested in voting because they want to vote for someone who is in a different party than yourself, you still have to register them. You can't consider what party they're with while you're doing your voter registration engagement. But the most important thing to keep in mind is that rules for voter registration, including things like deadlines and who's eligible to vote in a given community or state, they really do vary from state to state and sometimes vary from community to community. Take, for example, in Maryland, residents in Tacoma Park and other parts of Montgomery County are eligible to register to vote when they are 16 years old. Because at 16 years old, they are allowed to vote in local elections for city council, county boards, school boards, and so forth. And they can enter the voter registration rolls early so that they don't have to register again when they turn 18. This would not be true in the rest of Maryland, right? And for this reason, one of the most important things to do when starting a voter registration drive, and one of the things that I can't emphasize highly enough, is to take the time to sit down with the election officials in your local community. In most communities, this will be called either a board of elections or sometimes a county clerk or a city clerk. The people who run the elections will have guidelines that you should be aware of as you conduct your voter registration activity. If you happen to have officials in your county clerk's office who have not seen a lot of nonprofit voter engagement, they might try to dissuade you by telling you that it's a nonprofit, you can't participate, but just remain confident knowing that as long as all of your efforts are nonpartisan and don't coordinate with candidates, they are completely legal and you'll have no concerns about your tax-exempt status. A really helpful resource to take a look at as you're getting started is maintained by our partners over at Nonprofit Vote. You can take a look at voting in your state, and there's a link to that webpage at the bottom of this slide. And you can take a look and get a little bit more information on some of the key factors about how people vote in your given state, and one of the best contact information for reaching out to the election officials in your community. So after you know the law, you want to train your staff and your volunteers on the legal considerations, on filling out forms correctly, and ensuring forms are handed in promptly. There are some communities that say, we're eager to have as many people out there registering voters as possible, but we need to make sure all of the registrations get in a timely manner. So from the date of the registration that's signed by the voter, campaign has 7 days to turn it into the county clerk's office. That's actually an extreme example. Usually it's more like 20 days or 30 days, something of that nature. In other cases, you won't be training volunteers at all. Many communities are trying to go paperless with their elections, and they'll say, we don't provide forms for people to fill out, but we do have an online app, and you can send people to register voters using tablets or mobile phones, and they can fill out their voter registrations online through the volunteers that you're sending into the community. Regardless of what the unique circumstances are for your community, you'll want to make sure that all of your staff and volunteers are trained on voter registration and on the legalities that they might be asked about by potential voters. Voters might ask, am I eligible based on my age or based on my citizenship status and so forth. And so knowing how these relate to your volunteer registration drive will be very important. You'll want to invite local election officials from the county clerk's office or the Board of Elections to provide these trainings if possible. If your organization or coalition doesn't have the capacity to put someone in charge of doing these trainings, you might have success reaching out to your local League of Women Voters to see if they can train voter registration staff and volunteers for your voter engagement drive. Consider also the resources and tools that your voter registration team will need as they engage the community of low-income renters you're hoping to register. Always have enough registration forms if you're using paper forms. And if you're using, as I mentioned a moment ago, tablets or mobile phones, make sure that you have an ample supply of chargers that you can use to make sure that volunteers and staff are going out with fully charged hardware so that they can register as many volunteers before having to come back to get more juice. Consider also doing voter pledge cards. Voter pledge cards are important in states like New Hampshire, where people aren't allowed to collect registration forms themselves, but what they will do instead is collect a pledge card from someone who intends to vote and then mail that pledge card back to them a few days before the election, and the card reminds them of what they need to bring with them to register at the polling location. It's often helpful for people conducting voter registration to have with them sample ballots or fact sheets on the issues about the elections for people who are just kind of overwhelmed by the idea of voting, people who haven't done it before, people who are new voters and they don't feel qualified, they don't think they have the expertise. I think it's important to be able to show people that voting is a simple process. Here's a sample ballot. It's not that scary. Here are the kinds of issues that are being discussed in the campaign, and this relates to the vote that you'll cast and so forth. Being able to share these resources at doors or when talking to potential voters can be really helpful. So speaking of things that are really helpful, I'd like to break down a few best practices for today's presentation. And I think you'll probably have more thoughts and questions and ideas. So please feel free to hit that questions bar or the questions box on your control panel at the right-hand side of your screen. So first thing, and the first best practice is building voter registration into your day-to-day activities, right? Perhaps you are a nonprofit housing provider and you're working in resident services at an organization that brings on new residents to fill vacancies from time to time. When you're providing the initial documents at lease up, a copy of the lease, rules of the property, are you also providing voter registration information? Are you inviting them to update their registration because they recently moved into your property? Or perhaps you work at a service center. Maybe you work with tenants who are in crisis and looking for legal advice. Is there a stack of registration forms on your intake desk that people can grab and fill out? Is there a sign that says you're happy to submit their voter registration on their behalf? Think about the ways that you can build voter registration into the regular day-to-day work. Because if you think about it, doing a big voter registration drive in a couple of weeks is really hard. And that's why we're talking to you in December about an election likely to happen in November. Thinking about this now will allow you to unfold your voter registration work over a period of 11 months, and you can build toward your goal gradually over time rather than doing a frantic last-minute voter registration drive. But in addition to working voter registration into your day-to-day activities, it makes sense to plan specific events related to voter registration and civic engagement. Sometimes these events can include putting on a candidate forum for residents that live in your properties, inviting in candidates for city council, or doing a voter education session where you invite residents, provide some food, you inform them about here's what you need to bring with you to vote, here are some registration forms for those of you who aren't registered, and that you actually engage people at an event and invite them to register to vote. If you do such an event, and if you do provide things like food or beverages or childcare and so forth, just remember you can never make voter registration conditional upon receiving any kind of benefit, whether that's admission to an event or whether that's the pizza that's here, that kind of thing. It always has to be optional in all instances. Beyond doing specific voter registration events, consider doing door-to-door campaigns, especially if you work with or in low-income housing property. Consider not going door-to-door until you have a list of everyone registered in your property. Beyond that, establish a community presence. Use the windows of your service center or office. Use your social media. Make sure that people know that if they want to register to vote, they can go to your office or in some cases to your website, and that they can use your infrastructure to become a registered and informed voter. Finally, I really want to encourage all of you to keep records. Keeping records of who you've engaged and which registration forms you've collected can be extremely important. It can also help you avoid duplicating your efforts and going to the same door over and over again when very likely people in that door are registered or have registered. If you're collecting paper forms for voter registration, and if it's allowed in your community's rules, make copies of those forms before submitting them to the county or city clerk's office, because now you have the voter's address and you can send voter reminders prior to election day, but only if you keep those records. The records will also be important for demonstrating later on the success of your initiative as you consider in the future trying to attract funding, demonstrating the impact, or suggesting to elected officials that your organization has the ear of a large number of voters, their constituents. Consider participating in National Voter Registration Day, which in 2020 will be September 22nd. National Voter Registration Day is coordinated by a large coalition, including nonprofit votes, the National League of Secretaries of States, and the Voter Registration Day is a coordination of volunteer events throughout the country that people can find either to become a registered voter or to find a way to volunteer on that particular day. If you can think of a good event to hold, whether it's we've got some clipboards and we're going to go door to door, or we've invited all of our residents here today and we're going to get them registered, put that event on National Voter Registration Day's website. Volunteers will find you through the website. You'll also get some promotional posters, stickers, and other items that you can use to promote the dates and times of your event. But of course, National Voter Registration Day will be September 22nd. Consider also online voter registration. 38 states now allow online voter registration. Registration drives can now be done with tablets and smartphones, instead of just clipboards and paper forms. This is a really effective way to get people registered to vote. You kind of cut out the middleman, and the registration goes straight from the phone or the tablet to the local election official to update their voter rolls. The tricky thing with doing online voter registration is you, the organization registering people, don't capture the data of the people who are registering, right? There are some states that allow for a voter registration app that you can build that will allow, when people fill out the form, that it goes to the Secretary of State or the local election officials, that the form also goes to you, so that you can track your progress and have information about the voter you registered, so that months after registering them, you can also mobilize them and get them to the polls, right? This is a pretty rare tool. If you've seen tools out there from groups like Rock the Vote and so forth that have a voter registration app that you can build into your website or into your social media, those are really wonderful tools. But usually what happens is people click on the tool, they register to vote on your form, they click submit, and then you collect that data. And then they are taken to the website of the Secretary of State's office, and they have to fill out the form again. Many people get confused by this, and they don't actually complete the second form, and they don't actually complete their registration. So as you consider potentially using some of the online voter apps, consider whether or not it's important to your organization to collect records in that specific of a manner. The League of Women Voters maintains an excellent online voter registration resource that you can take a look at, and that link is at the bottom of your slide here. So, updating voter registrations. When in doubt, re-register. There is no penalty for registering to vote if you're already registered. Many of the communities we work with are people who move a lot. They're renters, and renters are more likely to be transients and to have moved recently. They're more likely to need to update their registration. In conversations with people who believe that they're already registered, you sort of have two approaches. You can check their registration online, again, through the League of Women Voters or whatever tool your state uses. Or, if you don't have the opportunity to check if they're already registered, just re-register. It only takes a couple of minutes, and there are so many states that are conducting voter roll purges and pushing people off of voter rolls if they've missed recent elections, that it's often smart just to be in the practice of re-registering, even if you believe you're already registered. There is a best practice that we're encouraging communities to consider. A model that we love is the city of Minneapolis, as well as the city of St. Paul in Minnesota, have passed local ordinances that require all landlords to provide voter registration materials and information to new residents with lease-up documents. This is not just subsidized landlords. This is not just low-income properties. This is all rental properties. When a new resident takes tenancy, they must be provided with voter registration information. We really hope that that model becomes popular and that more and more people and communities throughout the country adopt that model. So, some tips for effective registration campaigns. As I mentioned, get to know your local election officials, have an open line with them, be able to ask them questions, accept their guidance. Never accept, however, their discouragements. There are some election officials who can, unfortunately, take a partisan approach and try to stifle the vote. We've seen a lot of that, especially in southern states over the years. So definitely have them advise you on the law, but don't let them dissuade you from your efforts. Secondly, build a coalition. Consider other community organizations that have similar missions to yours and might be able to contribute different resources or share some of the burden. I definitely did a voter registration campaign in New Hampshire in 2016, and I found it frustrating when I'd be knocking on doors in low-income communities and hearing from a lot of people who said, oh, you guys were here yesterday. I already, took your information. Or, oh, we saw somebody last week and so forth. And a lot of the time, this is because multiple organizations were targeting sort of the same communities. If you can build a coalition that involves a healthy amount of collaboration, sometimes you can more narrowly target which part of the community you'll focus on. Maybe it can be broken down by neighborhood. Maybe it can be broken down by constituencies of various services. We work with families with children. We work with senior citizens. We work with veterans. Sometimes having that coalition and being able to divide up the work can be really helpful. It might also be really good to have a coalition because you can divide up the costs and the needs for resources. Some organizations might have a really large meeting space. Some organizations might have the ability to print out all the forms and copies for free. Some organizations might have a large network of volunteers that they can draw upon. Your efforts will always be stronger if done in a coalition manner. The last few times we've done this particular presentation on voter registration, we've done so in September or August before an election. And you'll see that now we're doing it in December. And that's to underscore this next point. It's never too early to start planning your voter registration drive. Indeed, if you want to attract resources, volunteers, and more buy-in, getting started early is really smart. And we hope that many of you, because you're on this webinar, are doing that now, and we hope that you'll encourage others in your community to start thinking about voter registration today. Also, always think about how to incorporate active tabling. We used to have a couple of slides on this. I cut them because of time, but active tabling is the idea that when you go to community events and you have a table that says register to vote, sitting behind that table is not always the best approach. Standing in front of it, moving around in the crowd, carrying your clipboard, carrying your tablet or your smartphone, engaging people to get them to register to vote is the smartest way to do it, or in some cases, to send them over to the table for more materials and so forth. Table in an active and a not passive manner to have better relationships with the people who you're encouraging to become new voters. And as I talk about active tabling, it occurs that we should also think about where our captive audiences exist. Where are there places where we're going to find a lot of people gathered, many of whom might need to register to vote? This can include places like waiting rooms. This can include when people are standing in a long line for a concert. This can include when people are spilling out of a very popular neighborhood church. Where are you going to find large groups of people who your volunteers want to register? And keep in mind the best ways to do this in a nonpartisan manner. Next, I want to encourage you all to think about how you track your progress so that you can record the number of registrations and then tell candidates, if you address our issues, voters will recognize it. In the last election, we were able to register 700 new voters in your district, and we passed out voter guides to each of them about what the candidates were saying on housing. Being able to provide a number that shows the impact of your efforts will always help to gain the ear of influential decision makers. So those are some of the best practices that we really wanted to highlight today. I'd like to now just go over a few common obstacles, and you'll see on this slide that there are 4 listed: voter apathy, locked apartment buildings, formerly incarcerated voters, and voting without an address. I'll point out that issues 3 and 4 on this slide we'll address briefly today, and we will address more expansively on a future webinar. So confronting voter apathy is something that is so difficult and so common, especially in low-income communities. There are a lot of people who have been engaged in the election process for years or decades, and they don't see things getting better. This skepticism is very logical and very easy to understand, but it can also cripple our efforts to work toward a brighter future. What you'll see on this slide is one of my favorite posters, something that I've always really loved. This is from a Massachusetts campaign on a ballot initiative related to healthcare issues. And it's a photo of a child that says, "I can't vote, but you can vote for me." And this is one of the ways that we can really confront voter apathy, by connecting a person's vote not just to their own narrow interests, but to the future of their own community. So much of the tone of elections is about fear and is about making people riled up about something that they might want to prevent, or an elected official that they might want to kick out. But all of the best research shows that the most effective messaging on voter registration and getting new people involved is positive messaging that focuses on the future of a community and a person's obligation or duty to contribute to that future. Obviously, when talking to voters who are skeptical about voting, always connect their vote to an issue that impacts their lives. This is not hard to do when talking to people in subsidized housing. We need to go vote so we have members of Congress who care about the public housing capital budget, so public housing isn't falling down everywhere. We need to go vote because, yeah, we might have housing here for the people who live here and it's changed their lives, but we know so many of our friends and relatives and neighbors are sitting on the waiting list and living doubled up or living in their cars. And what do we do to make sure that they have housing too, right? Connecting voting with an issue that someone cares about and that they personally feel strongly about is really important to get them to register. And this is why the best registration messaging often comes from beginning with listening to a voter and what their concerns are, and then pivoting from their concerns to why participating in the election can be part of bringing about change. One thing that is not on the slide, but I encourage people to do as well, is to mention to people the high number of very close elections in recent years. There have been elections for Senate in Minnesota or Florida that are being decided by a couple of hundred votes. There are elections for mayor. There are elections for Congress that are really being decided by a small number of people. In New Hampshire, the last presidential election went down to fewer than 1,000 people. And so one of the things I try to mention to people that when they think of someone in their community who has the opposite opinions of them, someone who they think has a different concept of what the future should be, remind them that that person is out there voting. And in order to overcome those votes, we need our community and its allies to be voting as well. The next challenge that you'll often see is locked apartment buildings. Obviously, if we're trying to register renters, locked apartment buildings are really a challenge because it's hard to get at their doors. Please remember that voter registration is not soliciting. The Supreme Court has established that participation in elections does not count as soliciting, and signs that say no soliciting do not apply to voter registration efforts. Now, that being said, owners and operators of private property can dictate who is allowed in their property. And so if they decide voter registration is not allowed, they can do so. And I should point out, we're talking about locked apartment buildings, but this also applies to gated housing communities. In 2018, I was doing a lot of voter registration and voter turnout work in Florida, and I really had never seen so many home ownership communities that had locked gates at the front and wouldn't let you come in, right? So in order to overcome this, the best approach is first, ask permission. I think you'll find that many owners of locked apartments will allow your campaign to come in and do voter registration if you tell them that it's nonpartisan, if you reach out to them in advance and tell them which days you would like to be there, and then put in a request in writing, and very often they will allow you in. In some cases, they will say that you're allowed in if you have a partner who actually lives on the property to go door to door along with you. This is one of the many reasons it's important to find and develop resident leaders to participate in your voter registration efforts. Neighbors can always engage their neighbors. That will always be acceptable. And so finding the resident leaders who will pledge to register everyone on their floor can be a really important tactic. One of the things we're working on at NLIHC, along with our partners in voter engagement, is identifying housing providers throughout the country, nonprofit housing providers, public housing agencies, even for-profit housing providers, who identify that registering their residents and mobilizing them is part of their role. And so we're working to identify owners and operators of housing who will commit to registering their residents, and that might involve inviting your organizations into their properties to do door-to-door registration drives. Remember, it's not that hard to find out where the subsidized properties are. If you visit preservationdatabase.org, which is a tool produced by NLIHC along with our partnership, the Public and Assisted Housing Research Council, you can find a list of all the subsidized properties in your community, or you can bring up a map like the one on the screen that shows the dots of where the subsidized properties are. You can hover over any one of those dots to get more information about the type of subsidy, how many apartments are there, who the owner and operator is if you want to reach out to that person. I'd like to talk also about voting for formerly incarcerated individuals. Very often when you're doing your voter registration drive in low-income communities, people say, I can't vote, I've been convicted of a crime, or I can't vote, I've been locked up, and they'll, just kind of move on. But the truth is, most people who have been convicted of a crime can vote. To the extent people are banned, it is always because of felony convictions and not misdemeanors. So that's an important distinction to know about. And in most states, a person who has been convicted of a felony, who has completed their probation and parole, they are eligible to vote. Again, in most states, it varies from state to state. There are only 3 states where all people with felony convictions are permanently banned from voting, and those are Virginia, Kentucky, and Iowa. If you live in one of those states, there's surely a campaign going on to change that, and I hope you'll participate in changing the laws so that people with felony convictions can become voters again. The last time I presented this slide, there was a 4th state, Florida, that was included under that bullet point. But Florida voters turned out in the 2018 election and overwhelmingly passed a ballot initiative restoring the right to vote for people convicted with felonies who have served their time. There are only 2 states in the country that allow people with convictions to vote while they are sitting in prison, and that's Vermont and Maine. In Vermont and Maine, no amount of criminal activity takes away your right to vote. The American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU, maintains a really wonderful map and resource at the link that is included on this slide. I encourage you all to take a look at it and understand what the restrictions are in your state. Finally, I want to talk about voting without an address. This is a question that we get a lot. The answer sometimes isn't exactly satisfying, but the most important thing for you to know is that people experiencing homelessness cannot be prevented from voting simply because of the lack of an address. That cannot be why they don't vote. But the tricky thing about voting for people who don't have an address is understanding which ward they belong to, which polling place they go to, which ballot that they're given. Because if you think about it, the city council member you vote for, the member of Congress you vote for, it depends on where you live, right? And so different states have different processes for establishing where someone lives. In some cases, people can list their sleeping locations on a park bench or in a bus shelter as their address for voting purposes. In other states, there are homeless service providers or shelters who can provide a signed document verifying someone's address for voting purposes. In other cases, people can sign sworn documents at the polling location stating that where they often sleep outdoors is in fact their address. When I was back in Wisconsin, when I did this, we used to be able to vouch for someone as a resident of a particular ward if we also were a voter in that ward. I've been told Wisconsin no longer allows this, but I think that it still exists in some states. But the answer to this question, like the answer to so many questions, is to be in touch with your local elected officials and get their guidance on how to register people without an address, if that's a significant portion of the community that you work with, a significant portion of the people that you work with. We will be doing in the summer a specific webinar just on this issue, where we'll bring in some experts who have worked on it in the past. Okay, so that was a lot of information. I really hope we have some questions to work through. If you haven't put in your question yet, you can enter your questions box. You can enter your questions in the questions box on the right-hand side. Should we give people the opportunity to raise hands? Is that, I don't know how big our audience is right now.
Yeah, we can do that.
If you'd like to hit the raise hand button on your control panel, we can unmute you and you can ask your question directly. What questions do we have right now, Tori?
Yep, we have, so we're holding a voter registration night for residents of our supportive housing organization. Is it allowed to give away incentives, water bottles, etc., and or enter them into a raffle for a gift card if they register?
That's a really great question. Who asked that question?
Rebecca Kaysen.
Okay, thanks, Rebecca. So the answer to your question is you can give incentives for people who attend the event, but the incentives cannot be whether or not they registered, right? So if you're putting people into a raffle, it has to include everybody who attended the event and wants to be in the raffle. If it's somebody who was too young to register or someone who didn't register because they know they already are, they have to be included in any of the incentives that you're providing because it's illegal to provide someone, and it happens all the time. It's not something that's such a big deal it ever gets really kind of like chased down by the IRS or anything like that. But it is not legal to give people an incentive to vote, right? So I've known like a lot of people who own a bar and they say, you know, you get a free beer if you wear an I voted sticker. That's actually not legal. You can't give an incentive for voting or for registering to vote. You can provide things of value that help people register or help people go vote. So if you have a bunch of registration forms and you want to hand out pens so people can fill them out, or you wouldn't be able to give someone cigarettes if they go in and vote, but you could give them potentially cab fare to get to the polling location. So if it's something of value that enables voting, that's allowed. If it's something of value that's just kind of an incentive to create that behavior, that's not allowed. So I really love the way you're thinking about this voter engagement event. I really want you to do the prizes and the incentives and the raffles. It just has to be for everyone who attends the event, whether they fill out a form or not.
Great, thank you. So I am a member of a fairly traditional, I'm not sure what BOD stands for.
Board of Directors.
Oh, sorry, Board of Directors for a local housing nonprofit. How would you set up a voter registration program for members of the Board of Directors who have not done this kind of work before? And how would you bring them in? And this question is from Robin Lane.
Hi, Robin. Great question. And there are definitely a lot of boards with a lot of diverse perspectives and a lot of diverse sort of political viewpoints. And some really want to be risk averse and stay away from elections altogether. So I would refer some of them to the webinar that we did back in September on the legal considerations of nonprofit voter engagement to address any of those concerns, or to take a look at the Alliance for Justice's Boulder Advocacy resources at boulderadvocacy.org. Which will address some of those concerns. But additionally, sometimes the best way to make this argument to people who don't understand why your organization should do it is the bar charts that I was showing you earlier about the gaps in voter registration and participation amongst renters and amongst low-income people versus homeowners and high-income people. There is no question that the reason we lack the political will to solve homelessness and the affordable housing shortage is because renters and low-income people are not as significant of a voting bloc to elected officials. And in some cases, you'll actually hear elected officials open their mouths and admit that. And they'll admit why they focus so much on homeowners and homeowners associations, right? And when the people who we serve and the people that your board of directors serves are considered lesser in the eyes of policymakers, that will always make the work of your board in achieving its mission harder. That will always put your board in a situation where they're working with fewer resources. And so in order to be a higher priority for the important community decision makers around you, the board should sort of have an openness to nonpartisan voter registration work. And I think it's also important to remind board members who might be hesitant about it that there are some things that the organization's involved in that individual board members might not participate in, and that's totally okay as well. I hope that's a decent answer, but if you want to ask a follow-up that's more specific, feel free to put that in the questions box.
Great, thanks. I have another question could you let us know where to find or repost stats on renter versus owner, low income versus high income voters? Yeah,
so the bar charts that we used today come from the Census Bureau. And we have national data on that. State and local data might exist, but right now we run it nationally. We are going to put some more infographics on the ourhomes-ourvotes.org website. Those bar charts will be on there right now. You can use them. You can sort of modify them to put your own logo on them and so forth. Or if you're having trouble doing that, get in touch with us and we can partner with our communications team to make that possible. And additional data is, in terms of more specificity, is rare because in exit polling almost never asks the question, are you a renter or are you a homeowner? And they only sometimes ask the question about someone's income. And so we're interested, if we can acquire the funding, to participate in some exit polling in 2020 to put that question in exit polls and get more samples about renters versus homeowners and how they turned out to the polls, as well as what issues were important to them when they were at the polls and what their voting behaviors were. So I can send you, if you reach out to me, my email is going to be on the next slide or 2 slides from now. If you send me an email, I can send you the link to the census data that we use, and you can take a look at that. But what we draw from is from the Census Bureau.
Great. I have another one. This is from Melina. Is there a specific affordable housing plan or item that you want the presidential candidates to address? To me, it's not enough that they acknowledge the problem, but have a specific plan in place.
Completely agree. And we definitely take that approach. And one of the slides earlier showed you a glimpse of something that's also on the website, which is solutions to the affordable housing crisis, right? And this is where we lay out what the problems are and what the solutions need to be. And frankly, because we did that, many of the candidates reached out to us about what should be in their housing plans, and we engaged with all of them the same way. We never give any of them preferential treatment, of course. But the solutions that we lay out are in specific categories, but we provide enough room for the candidates to decide how they want to address it. So we lay out some of our priorities like public housing, housing choice vouchers, the National Housing Trust Fund. We talk about the shortage of subsidies such that only 1 in 4 low-income households who are eligible for assistance actually receives it. And we put all of that in the document. And what we've seen as a result of that document, as a result of telling them the types of solutions we're looking for, is that their housing platforms have very much followed that framework. And what's interesting is once one candidate puts out their housing platform, the next candidate feels like they need to one-up that platform. So they take that platform and they add a couple of things to it. And then each one has a couple of new features and so forth. And it creates a sort of brinksmanship that we found really delightful in the campaigns, where we now have presidential candidates who are releasing an additional housing plan where they've added an addendum, they've added new things to it. So you can learn more about each candidate's plans if you go to our website, ourhomes-ourvotes.org. Each candidate has their own space on the website. You can look at their plans You can look at videos of them talking about affordable housing issues and so forth. And I think you'll really enjoy seeing what candidates are saying about housing.
Great. That's it for questions.
All right. So I'm going to do just a couple of other slides, but if other questions occur to you, either raise your hand or put a question in the questions box. Do we have any raised hands right now? Okay. So this is the fourth webinar in our Third to Thursdays at 3 webinar and podcast series. I think we are going to move toward the podcasts in the next couple of months and see how that platform works out. The upcoming topics are voter registration part 2, which will be specifically about registering residents of subsidized housing, how to find them, how to work with the owners and operators of subsidized housing. And then in February, we'll talk about the role of housing providers. We'll bring in some people who actually own and operate housing and talk to them about how they can be more involved and how they can partner with some of you as well. We're going to get into getting candidates on the record, surveys, town halls, forums, and then educating voters about what those candidates have said. We're going to talk about overcoming some common obstacles, some of which we talked about today, which relate to things like formerly incarcerated people and people without an address. We'll also talk about language barriers in voting, and we will talk about disability in voting on that webinar. In July, we're going to get into the challenge of voting while homeless. And then in August and September, we're really going to talk about get out the vote. You know, the election's coming. How do we get people to the polls? In October, just a few weeks shy of the election, we'll talk about getting people out on election day and effective election day tactics. And then finally, in November of 2020, we're going to talk about, now that we've had these wonderful election engagement efforts and we've got all these candidates who have made pledges of what they're going to do on housing, how do we hold them to their promises? Remember that NLIHC is a membership organization. We require the support of our members to be able to do election engagement work and provide the tools that exist on our website and provide the updates and engagement that so many of you are learning about today. Finally, that's me, and that's my contact information. In case any of you have questions or you'd like to reach out, very happy to help you as you're thinking through the beginnings of your voter registration efforts. And with that, I will ask Tori, are there any more questions that have come in?
Nope, no more questions or raised hands.
All right. So I want to thank all of you for joining us today. I want to thank you for your interest in registering low-income voters and their allies. And if you have any questions, be in touch. In the meantime, check out ourhomes-ourvotes.org and have yourselves a great holiday. Bye.